Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was the chief tax collector and was wealthy. He wanted to see who Jesus was, but because he was short, he could not see over the crowd. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore fig tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. When Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and said to him, "Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today." So he came down at once and welcomed him gladly. All the people saw this and began to mutter, "He has gone to be the guest of a sinner." But Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, "Look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor, and if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount." Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost."
Thank you, Carolina. Brilliant. I wonder for you what it might be when it comes to the things that you find it more difficult to totally trust Jesus with. The things that maybe are the biggest barriers to saying, "I completely want you to be Lord of that area of my life." As I thought about this, I think there's 2 for me. One, and bearing in mind, God has come through time and time again on this one. It's not a big picture all of the time. I just notice it in moments. And that is to do with what is going to happen in my future. Now, I do trust God that I have a future ahead of me that is good and that is all of that kind of stuff. But so often, my actions and my thoughts, actually, I act like I'm going to work all of that out and I'm going to make it all happen. And the other one, I think, is probably to do with like recognition or status or feeling like I am of value where I am placed. And this shows itself most in me realizing that so often I care about the opinion of others and what they say and how they think about me more than I do care about the opinion of God or the opinion of Jesus or what he says I should be or do in moments. Now, it's not all of the time, but I recognize that there is a deliberateness I need to be aware of saying, "Jesus, I want you to be Lord of all of those things." Also, in preparing to take this kind of passage seriously, I was reminded, and you'll see why later on, of a friend in my life who I grew up with, same youth group, same opportunities to know God and meet with God. And whereas I really felt like Jesus spoke to me, and I felt like God was real, actually, he went in completely the other direction and found himself not feeling it and not noticing and not wanting really, or maybe he did want to, but not seeing what was going on around him to do with his relationship with God. And over time, more and more became more and more adamant that God neither existed nor was really good in any way. And looking at that person's life now, actually, they've been really successful in a lot of what they've done. That in their job, in the eyes of the world, there's a lot of recognition. They're in a band that's doing really well. There's loads of stuff about that person's life that I've been like, it's gone okay for them actually. And what I realized, I think, in preparing this is that I'd sort of forgotten to expect Jesus to move in this person's life. I'd sort of not necessarily written them off because I know God can meet anyone, but I'd stopped being expectant that something might happen in this person's life, that there might be a turnaround moment. And today's passage is about a life transformed when meeting Jesus. A massive change. And as we look at this chapter in Luke 19, we're going to go in 3 parts, this treasure series, seeing Jesus as our treasure. Today it's Jesus and the tax collector. But over the next 3 weeks, we're going to look at 3 stories that are going to help us to unpack a few different things. But the big picture of this book and of some of these stories is that they are for the outsider. Verse 10 of today's passage is a really key verse in the Gospel of Luke, that Jesus comes to seek and save the lost. And so when we read stories in this Gospel and when we look at this one today, that should be a helpful backdrop. Now, I'm just going to address an elephant that's about to plod into the room here. I say path. Many here will say path. I say bath. Many here will say bath. I say grass. Many here will say grass. I say chaff, Psalm 1. Many of you will say chaff. That's fine. And as we come to the name of today's character, I say Zacchaeus, and many in here will say Zacchaeus. It's okay. I tested this on the staff team earlier this week, and I was definitely in the minority. And so my encouragement to you this morning in general, and on this particular thing, is don't let it distract you. Show me grace. This is a passage all about grace. Have grace with me for my slightly northern interpretation of this passage. But it's about a guy called Zacchaeus. And let's go into the passage. So it's going to come up on the screen, the first verse. Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus, grace needed. He was a chief tax collector and was wealthy. So who was this man? Who was this tax collector in this moment? Let's just set the scene of where we are and what this would have meant. Okay, he was somebody who was very wealthy, but he was also somebody who would have been very disliked. Very often, tax collectors were Jewish people who decided to go and work for the occupying nation, in this context, the Romans, and to work for them. And to in many ways, they would have been seen as a traitor. And you could understand why people would have said that and thought that. And if that wasn't enough, very often, and I'd imagine with a chief tax collector, which is what we're told Zacchaeus is that they would have taken more money than they needed to and kept it for themselves. They'd have taken from everyone in their local community, maybe people that they'd been brought up with, people they'd gone to the same synagogue down the road as, and they would be taking money off them because they had the power of a Roman guard around them. And so basically what they said went, and people would have had to pay and pay more. And this person, this Zacchaeus, he would have been absolutely hated. And when it comes to the kind of people that this Jewish audience would expect Jesus to want to meet with, he is like right down here. If you imagine the person in your life who is furthest away from God, maybe a family member who gives you grief at Christmas about the faith that you hold. Maybe it is somebody at work who you know actually, they seem all sorted, it's all fine, but they're really actually quite aggressive in some ways about what it is that you believe. Maybe you have examples of this in your life. Or maybe, like me, you just have people around who you think, you know what, they seem fine. And actually, there's not a massive need for Jesus, it seems. Now, in any of those examples, and if you have any in your mind, Zacchaeus is right there up amongst the least likely people to meet with Jesus. And so far we know him to be rich. We know him in the context of this book to be lost. We can see that as we come into this, we can assume that he's lost, that he doesn't know God. And we also find out that he's short. So carrying on, verse 3, he wanted to see who Jesus was, but because he was short, he could not see over the crowd. So we know about Zacchaeus that there is at least a curiosity. What his motives are, I don't think we're clear about yet, but I think as we go through the story today, we'll see more and more what Jesus and Zacchaeus' moment is about, and that it wasn't just a random thing that happened because it happened, but was a divine appointment. But actually in this moment, at least we know that Zacchaeus is curious about who Jesus is. And I thought about going past, because I was trying to build a picture of who this person was in my mind. I thought about going past the short bit, but I don't know why that they'd say it if it wasn't something. And there's two wonderings I have. One, I wonder whether, has anyone seen Shrek? The movie Shrek? Yeah. One of my favorite movies growing up. There's a guy called Lord Farquaad in it, okay? And he was a very powerful and rich man. He's also quite a short man. And there's an amazing line that Shrek finds himself funnier than everyone else in it, where he says, do you think he's compensating for something? And I just wonder, and this is definitely the commentary of Josh Moxon and not some of the other commentaries I've looked at on this passage. They're a little bit maybe more definite about things, but there's a part of me that wonders whether he's always had a little bit of a complex, and some of his life decisions in terms of maybe he has physically and in other ways been looked down on by those around him. And so he said, you know what, I'm going to go after status. And I'm going to go after wealth, and I'm going to go after power to show them. And I wonder, as we paint this picture of Zacchaeus in that way, there's a part of us that might be beginning to feel a little bit more sorry for him. And I do think that there's a moment in all of the passages where we often kind of have this picture painted for us of somebody who is bad, but actually every person has a story. And I wonder whether that's how Jesus saw Zacchaeus, with the eyes of compassion and the eyes of wanting him to come into a place of knowing him for himself. So he ran on ahead, this is verse 4, and climbed a sycamore fig tree, as a picture's going to come up on the screen, to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. Now, my understanding, the other reason maybe it's in short is because the tree's quite small, low down to the ground, easy for anyone to climb. But that is true. But I always pictured these trees a little bit like a sticky tree where it would be super obvious. And most of the kids' storybooks I've ever read depict it that way as well. He is very, very visible, Zacchaeus is. But actually, this picture illustrates that potentially Zacchaeus wanted to see, but he didn't want to be seen. He wanted to see Jesus coming his way, but he didn't want to have any confrontation or any moment necessarily with Jesus, or at least he wasn't sure about this at that point. But make no mistake, as much as I have talked about Zacchaeus a lot, this narrative is not about him. This narrative is about Jesus. Zacchaeus is an example to us of who Jesus is in a moment when you meet him. So this is a passage about Jesus. Also, it's worth noting that in this moment for Zacchaeus, I think in order to see Jesus, he's had to do something that somebody of his status wouldn't really do. He's run along, he's had to pull up his cloak, and he's had to run along, and he's climbed a tree. Now, I mentioned that he had Roman guard with him. They are going to be talking to one another. You know, these ripped men that Jago was talking about earlier. They're going to be talking to one another, being like, what is Zach on today? Like, he's lost it. He's running around, he's running in the dust. And so there's a sense to which Zacchaeus has been shameless in his pursuit of seeing Jesus. It has already cost him something in the context of maybe his reputation. And when Jesus reached the spot, he looked up to him and he said, Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today. The passage tells us that Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. Maybe he heard whisperings in the crowd of some tax collector called Zacchaeus has run ahead and climbed a tree. We don't know that. But Jesus knew his name. It seems like there's something here that is more than just noticing someone up a tree and having a moment. There was an intentionality. There's something intentional. Not only has Zacchaeus put himself in a place to see Jesus, but Jesus has sought him out. He has called him by name. And for many of us, I don't think we put ourselves in the bracket as somebody who is worthy to be called by name by Jesus. Can I encourage you this morning that if you are somewhere looking in, Jesus wants to look up to you and say to you by name, I want to come to your house. I want to come and I want to know you. In the original language on this passage, the phrase, I must stay, it was as strong as, it is God's will that I stay at your house. It is God's will that I'm here. This is a divine appointment. This is deliberate from Jesus. He's seeking and saving the lost. And there's one of the less Josh Moxon commentaries, but a good one, talked about how actually in this moment, maybe inviting Jesus into his home, that was the moment of salvation for Zacchaeus. That's when he realized, okay, I'm responding to something real here. I think there's other parts of the passage that confirm it to us and maybe build the picture a little bit more strongly, but I found that really interesting because I'd never thought of it that way before. Because going to somebody's house as well in that culture is much bigger maybe than it is today. It was a sign of acceptance. It was a sign of, it was real, an intimate thing in many ways. It was culturally a really big thing. And so for Jesus to do that, I mean, people already felt like Jesus was messing around with things that he shouldn't. But this is just another one of those examples of how Jesus' qualifications for the kingdom are not what we think they are. And we know that the people didn't like it. In verse 7, they're muttering and they're saying, going to be the guest of a sinner. And I wonder, as Zacchaeus kind of got down from his tree and wandered along with Jesus to his house, he would have heard these things. It probably wouldn't be new to him. I think he knew that he would be disliked. It's very likely that that is the case. But I do wonder, as he hears this guest of a sinner, I wonder whether there's something starting to happen in his heart where Jesus is going to take some of those mutterings to become a moment to meet him. Of actually, there is truth in what they're saying, in that all sin and fall short of the glory of God. Let's not take ourselves out of identifying with Zacchaeus in this story. If we're going to be either of them, it's him. And so there's this moment, I suppose, where we're beginning again to see that Jesus' qualifications are a little bit different to what we might expect them to be. In previous chapters in Luke 18, we see Jesus bringing a beggar, bringing children, and bringing sinners and saying, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. It's similar in this story here. And we don't get told, in some ways I was a bit annoyed as I was reading it, we don't get told what happens at dinner. That would be really helpful, wouldn't it? We have this moment where he's invited and then a minute and a huge response. And I thought about getting a chair and sitting down here, so when I squat, that's what I'm doing, okay? We don't get told what the dinner is like. And I wonder whether there's a deliberateness for the writer here that maybe he knows that the church going forward would make it into some sort of unbreakable formula of what happens to take somebody from a tree to giving up everything for Jesus. And maybe we shouldn't. Maybe it's more important who was there. It's more important the person that was invited to dinner, and that person being Jesus. And I wonder, as they sat there with the disciples and others, it wouldn't necessarily been a tiny thing. It would have been quite a few people there, quite possibly. And I wonder, as Jesus talks to him, but maybe Jesus is starting to talk to his disciples as well, and he's just seeing how he interacts with people and some of the things that Jesus has said. You know, we get the privilege of having so much of what Jesus said written for us here in the Bible. But in these moments, we would imagine that Jesus was the same Jesus, speaking about things that mattered and showing love and showing care. And I just wonder whether sitting in that seat, Zacchaeus hasn't been looked at with eyes of love, maybe since he was a young boy at the synagogue. And maybe his mind is going back to moments and things he's read in the Torah, things that he has read in the wisdom scriptures, things that he has been told about a coming Messiah, and is beginning to build a picture, or has already decided that this Jesus is something more than just a teacher, that this Jesus might be the real thing, that might be not just a man, but the Messiah. And you see the almost awkwardness of verse 8, which is going to come up on the screen, of Zacchaeus is sort of like, sitting down, he's like, oh, I need to say something. This is a big moment. And it feels awkward because he goes, look, Lord, that's important that he calls him Lord. Look, Lord, here and now, not in the future, here and now, half of what I have, give it to the poor. And what else can I do? If I've cheated anyone, he would have done, by the way, and it would have been loads of people. Most people, if not all people. And if I've cheated anyone, I'd give it back. No, give back double. No, I give back 4 times the amount. Zacchaeus is broken. His USP of maths in being a tax collector is broken. I did a little bit of maths in my mind, and I could be totally wrong about this. I think he's gone into debt. It doesn't quite work, does it? It is extravagant and unthought out. But I think what we're supposed to see, because we don't know what happens at the meal, we just know his response. I think what we're supposed to take from this is that when Jesus sits with you, and by the way, that's the invitation to every one of us as a follower of Jesus, to sit with him and to know him, that our response is extravagant. True repentance leads to real change. And this is the change that we're seeing. It's a 180 as he looks at Jesus. It's turning from what was most important to him. We've already seen him give up a little bit of his kind of like reputation stuff in the way that he's gone about meeting Jesus. And here we see him giving up his riches in saying, not only are they less important to me, but they're so far less important to me that I've forgotten how to do what I'm best at in meeting with Jesus. And I think there's a moment for us to take as well where we look at our own lives and we look at this story and we say, if he's not Lord of all, and the thing that might have been most difficult for Zacchaeus in that moment, if he's not Lord of all, then is he Lord at all? And a couple of weeks ago, Jago spoke to us from the passage just before this in Luke 18 about the rich young ruler. And in many ways is in a similar position to Zacchaeus of being wealthy. And in that story, we see, as much as he's seen as a good man and doing loads of stuff right, he couldn't give up that one thing that was his vice, which was his wealth. He couldn't give it up. And you read that story and you feel a bit depressed and a bit sad because you're like, it didn't work. The Jesus meeting didn't work. And yet this story is redemptive of that one. Because it's saying, actually, and in that passage it says nothing is impossible with God. And this is the proof that nothing is impossible with God. That no one is too far gone to be met by the reach of Jesus. And I think it's worth noting as well as we zoom out of the passage and as we think about our own lives and our response to Jesus. Responding to Jesus, it costs. We know how much it cost Jesus in his death on the cross. We are coming up to a time of Easter where that gets highlighted and shown. We know as we think about the extent of our own debt, that we can't ignore the fact that we have stuff that we need to work on as well. Areas that Jesus isn't totally Lord. Areas we've forgotten to expect the impossible from God. Actually, in these moments, we're saying we recognize the cost of the cross and therefore probably the cost for us as well to follow Jesus with everything. And I hope today that Zacchaeus is a platform and an inspiration for us to do that well. Somebody able to give up everything. And the way that Jesus looks for Zacchaeus and looks at Zacchaeus is the way that he looks for and wants to look at every single one of us. And maybe you don't feel seen by Jesus. Maybe you feel like you are somewhere in a tree as part of this story and you're just looking in. Can I encourage you that Jesus is standing there and he wants to know you and he wants to come to your house? Often that's been referred to as inviting Jesus into your heart. Commentators have talked about that as what this passage could mean. And that's the invitation to each and every one of us this morning. And as we go through into verse 9, Jesus confirms, I think, what we've been saying is going on. Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house because this man too is a son of Abraham." And son of Abraham, true Jew, is total acceptance. It's a really big thing to say in that moment. And then I guess we finish where we started. For the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost. No one is beyond the reach of Jesus. Jesus came to seek and save the lost. True repentance leads to real change. We see that in this passage, and no one is beyond the reach of Jesus. Thinking of the stories that I said at the beginning around my future. For me, my response to this passage should be, whatever that is, I'm all in and I trust you. Not my individual little questions within it, my kind of, I will do this if you do that. It is, I'm here, I'm all in. And around recognition, status, feeling of worth to those around me, it's going to be a journey. But to say, Jesus, I really, really want what you say about me, the identity that you have given me to be the thing that is shouting loudest or even the only voice. Help me to follow you in that way. Lord of all, my life. And there'll be different things for each one of us in here. For some of us, it might be the same as Zacchaeus. It might be to do with reputation and riches. A good question to ask yourself is, what don't I want to give up? What couldn't I live without? And then ask yourself the question, where does that line up next to Jesus? Or the story I told of my friend. This week and last week, as I've been thinking about this passage, I've been praying for that person more than I have in many, many years. I'd forgotten. But this passage has highlighted to me the need as somebody who does know Jesus to be intentional and to be deliberate and to trust that the impossible in my mind is not the impossible for God. So that person, that family member, the people that you have maybe discounted, and by the way, there's no shame in that. It's so easy to just, busyness of life, what you see in front of you, to make the expectations on God smaller than they should be. But my encouragement to us this morning is to go back to the place where we realize that God can do anything, can meet anyone, can call anyone. It's an unusual passage in the sense that Jesus seeks someone intentionally. So often in the Gospels, it's this person came and was sick, or somebody came on behalf of somebody else and said, Jesus, please come. But I think this story illustrates that Jesus is after us as much as he hopes that we will be after him. And so we should respond in that way. What lives am I expecting Jesus to turn around? Where in my own life do I want to say, you are Lord of all? I'm going to invite the band to come and join me, and I'm going to invite you to stand, but then I'd like to explain 3 things that I think we can do as response. So let's stand together. And ultimately, our response is possible not because Zacchaeus climbed a tree, but because Jesus died on one. That's why we get to have a moment like we do now to respond. In Lent, I think we talk a lot about reacting or resolving or those kind of things. This is not a try harder message. This is a look harder message. Be deliberate about looking to Jesus, responding to him. And my encouragement to us is that as we do that, he will meet us. He will come and he will have dinner with us. And as we look into his eyes, everything changes. So come and see. Let him in and respond. There's 3 ways I'd love us to respond today. First, if you've never responded to Jesus in your own heart and you want to say, Jesus, I want to know you. I want you to come and be part of my life. I want to turn my back on the things that I've done wrong, say sorry, and come to know you. I would really encourage you to do that this morning. I encourage you to make a brave step and come forward. One of the prayer team would absolutely love to pray with you about that. In fact, while we do this, can the prayer team come forward now as well, please? And the second thing is Jesus Lord of every area of my life? Is he Lord of every area of my life? Ask that question as we begin to sing, as the band begins to play, as we begin to respond, as we turn our eyes to Jesus. Are you Lord of every area? And I'd encourage you, if you know that there is a little thing or a big thing where that isn't true, do some business with God this morning. And if it's helpful, and I think it often can be, come and be accountable about that. Pray with somebody else here at the front and say, this is what it is for me. And there's no judgment. All sin falls short of the glory of God. All of us have little, big things that we have to journey with God in becoming more like Jesus. And then I think for a lot of us as well, and I think that this should be a secondary response point and not an only response point, is that person that came to mind that you want to pray for. Pray for them now. Commit to praying for them this week. Commit to reaching out maybe and being a light to them. But deciding to make a commitment this morning to do that. I'm going to say a short prayer and then I'd encourage you to come forward and pray with somebody from the team here. Jesus, I thank you. I thank you that you seek and you save us. I thank you that when we say sorry and when we mean it, it leads to real change in our lives. I thank you that it leads to the best life in all of its fullness. And we thank you again that no one is beyond your reach today or any day. Help us as we sing, help us as we pray now in response to all you've wanted to speak to us about through this passage today. In Jesus' name, amen.